Hello, everyone. Welcome to a virtual Yale University Art Gallery and to this e-gallery conversation, Minimalism and Its Legacies, in which we will engage a few of the key works within the installation of minimalist prints, drawings, and small-scale sculpture currently on view in the gallery's fourth floor special exhibition galleries through June 25th. My name is Lisa Hodomarski, and I'm the Sutphin Family Curator of Prints and Drawings at the gallery, and one of the co-organizers of this installation, along with, and joining me on screen today, John Hogan, the Mary Jo and Ted Shen Installation Director and Archivist for Sol LeWitt Wall Drawings, Isabel Segraves, the Florence B. Selden Senior Fellow in the Department of Prints and Drawings, and Mitchell Herman, a PhD candidate in the history of art here at Yale and our former graduate curatorial intern on this project. Not with us today is our colleague Freda Spira, the Robert L. Solly Curator of Prints and Drawings. The genre of minimalism can trace its beginnings back to the mid-1960s, when a group of New York-based artists began to focus on the pure, clean elements of materiality, geometry, color, and hard edges in their work. To a great extent, they avoided emotional content and metaphor and de-emphasized the maker's hand. These artists, who came to be known as minimalists, chose a precise economy of media and established parameters or even systems that governed their art making. From their beginnings, minimalist artists embraced working on paper in drawing and printmaking. As one of the most ubiquitous and simplest of materials, paper was a support that dovetailed beautifully with their pared down aesthetic. The Yale Art Gallery's collection is remarkably rich in its minimalist holdings of works on paper. Indeed, save for one loan from the LeWitt collection, the current installation is drawn entirely from the gallery's permanent collection, which includes well over 350 minimalist works. This extraordinary number made the process of organizing this rotation particularly challenging, yet also invigorating, as we took a deep dive into the material and engaged in lively debate over inclusions and exclusions. For those of you intrigued on what we present today, we invite you to visit the installation, to explore our minimalist holdings in greater depth through the gallery's online collection search, and even to schedule in-person visits to our study room to view more minimal conceptual works on paper. Today, John, Isabel, and Mitchell will each present for approximately 10 minutes. And then near the close of the tour, all four of us would be happy to field your questions. To that end, we encourage participants in this program to post their queries in the Q&A at any time, queries which can be directed to a single speaker or generally to the group. I will now pass the screen over to John Hogan. John?
Thank you, Lisa. In the slide that you're currently looking at has two very tall rectilinear forms. They are by the American artist Anne Truitt, born in 1921, passed away in 2004. The two vertical works are Moore from 1983, the taller of the two, and April from 1996, are seen here in dialogue with each other, neither taking superiority, only presenting its individual reality, evoking human form, yet not to be seen as an abstraction of life, but a moment separated by 13 years of age difference, yet remaining timeless, color ruling each independently. Painted on all sides of Truitt's rectilinear forms, they increase in complexity, compelling the viewer to regard these works from every angle where they can be seen as anything actually but square. The structural element of Anne Truitt's sculptures made of wood are armatures for color. The artist painted multiple delicate layers characterized by subtle variations. Truitt stated, "What is important to me is not geometrical shape per se, or color per se, but to make a relationship between shape and color which feels to me like my experience, to make what feels to me like reality." Though her sculpture is often situated within minimalism, it does not share the moment's interest in the neutrality of industrial products. Indeed, standing in contrast to her minimalist contemporaries, her work was made by hand. As the artist stated less than a decade before creating Armour, "I've struggled all my life to get the maximum meaning from the simplest of form." Abstract, yet rich with feeling, these works are grounded in memories and sensations accumulated over her long lifetime. This referentiality is in stark contrast to the literalness of much of minimalism, a moment with which her work is always associated, but for Truitt, a level of abstraction provided a syntax for her impressions of people, places, ideas, moments, and events. She wielded color and form as metaphors for thought, developing a visual grammar that remains unique in the history of art. The visual sophistication of the pieces suggests that they are not sculptures at all, but actually 3D paintings. Truitt continued to go against the grain, making it impossible to categorize objects in which simplicity and obliqueness play off of one another with delicacy, dignity, and grace. Truitt wanted depth and dimensionality in her work. She often painted and sanded her sculptures repeatedly, applying as many as 30 to 40 coats by hand, creating a surface both smooth and deeply saturated and nuanced. The resulting is a very handmade look, and Truitt's work was also much too optical for her contemporaries. Red seen face on is not the same red as seen at the receding angles of the forms, even if they are composed of the exact same pigments. Truitt deliberately plays these perceptual differences off of one another, while the ideal minimalist object, as Donald Judd said, is just one thing, or as Robert Morris said, the relationships out of the work and takes the relationships out of the work and makes them a function of light space in the viewer's field of vision. Internal relations are very important in Truitt's work and much of the unknown essence of the work. These three works, titled Summer of '96, number 101, 78, and 76, seen in descending order. And Truitt, these works are acrylic on paper, roughly 8 inches in height and 30 inches in width. Truitt was also a writer of 5 literary books created 5 literary books, created visual works that address many of the topics from which she wrote. Truitt embraced the themes of memory and nostalgia, childhood, and human relationships that she also dealt with as topics. The 3 works become a diaristic moment whose focus might prompt a return to the past through memory. Central to her work is the relationship between structure and surface. Meticulously painted onto various substrates such as paper and canvas and the wooden sculptures that you see previously, they became personal and referential in content. These works stand somewhat within minimalism, but are conceptually contrary. In her day book from 1982, she wrote on June 6th, "In Kyoto, I once saw women rinsing dyed lengths of cloth in the Kamo River. The unwieldy lengths of cloth rippled out in long ribbons of blue and green and yellow and orange and red. The river rushed over the colors. The cloths whipped in swift waves. The women held on to the streamers for dear life." Each of Truitt's works are stand-ins for a moment, a person, a memory, and a sensation. Next slide, please. These 2 works are from the artist Joe Behr, born in 1929, and currently residing in the Netherlands. The larger work on the left is titled Cardinations 8. What is your first perception of this image? Baer began this series of prints in 1973, utilizing as source material the cardinal numbers of 1 through 9, presenting them in a series of prints with the different numbers and their placements in various locations on the page. She chose to configure in different ways. The numbers actually are contained within the circle. Back up, please. Sorry. The numbers are contained within the circles, but perceptually, they're not necessarily read as a number at all, but simply a form. Working on paper allowed a rethinking of her process from painting, she said. Painting is a flat surface on a physical object, but the print requires a degree of realism in the sense that it is a language on a page that represents visual signs in space. The smaller work, located on the left, is titled Agent from 1962. It is a part of a body of Baer's work created in 1962 and 63 that became known as the Koreans, a name given them by Richard Bellamy, a New York art dealer, stating that Baer's work was as well known as Korean art in the West in the 1960s. That is to say, not at all. This work, washed on paper, is a reference to larger paintings on canvas, not a study for them, but what became a way to create independent works that entered into dialogue with the paintings. The seemingly empty square is unto itself an investigation of the color white. A black border initially seems to make a hard edge, but that hard edge is broken by a blue line and a blue underline entering into it, the exterior edge giving a visual break to allow the white to reemerge. In 1967, Robert Morris wrote of Baer's intentions in her work. Every part is painted and contiguous to its neighbor. No part is above or below or any other part. There is no hierarchy. There is no ambiguity. There is no illusion. There is no space or interval of time. Baer's meditative sense of space rewards the eyes with the shift of what is perceived given the time if you look closely. Next slide, please. And now I turn it over to Isabel.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Now we are going to turn to prints by two artists, Bryce Marden and Agnes Dennis, who both bring elements of minimalism into conversation with the natural world. As Lisa noted in the introduction, many artists connected to minimalism were hesitant to invite associations beyond the object itself, instead choosing to emphasize the pure materiality of the object and how it engaged industrial or systematic processes. However, as we hope to demonstrate in this installation, minimalism is not a unified or hegemonic movement, and artists veered between the objective and the expressive depending on their own goals. Bryce Marden, for example, did not reject the expressive qualities present in the art of the abstract expressionists, but instead adapted their emphasis on mark making and subjective experience into a body of work that was more controlled and less personal than that of his predecessors. Marden, whose print we are looking at now at the screen at right, earned his MFA from Yale in 1963, where he met, among others, Richard Serra, Sylvia Plymouth-Mangold, and Robert Mangold, all artists included in this installation. At Yale, he learned etching and was instantly taken with the technique's potential for a variety of different kinds of mark making, as well as its inherent tactility. However, Marden stepped away from etching for much of the 1960s as he worked instead in screen printing, lithography, and painting. Marden returned to etching in 1971 at the invitation of Robert Feldman, then director of Parasol Press, and he traveled to California to collaborate with printer Catherine Brown to create a different series of etchings entitled 10 Days. This series was a breakthrough for Marden, who began to fully grasp the effects he could achieve through the etching medium, as well as how the technique could fit with his interest in integrating planar geometric compositions with an emphasis on the mark. Just after creating 10 Days in 1971, Marden embarked upon a transformative visit to Greece, which inspired his next series of etchings entitled Adriatics. The print that we included in our installation seen here is from this portfolio. Marden completed Adriatics in 1973, and it consists of 7 etchings, 3 with aquatint. In this installation photograph, you can see that the rectangular composition is divided in half along a horizontal line, and the lower section is aquatinted to create a densely inked black surface. Diagonal lines slash across the upper half. Unlike the compositions of many of the minimalist artists on view, including the Agnes Martin barely visible here to the left, Marden's lines are irregular. He does not make the diagonals perfectly parallel, and there's evidence of him retracing and reworking each line. The top half also reveals that Marden chose to present the messiness inherent in the process of printing, as there are smudges of ink, plate tone, and other scratches, some of which Marden added deliberately. 5 of the other prints in the series utilize the format of the vertical rectangle divided into 2 smaller squares, while the remaining 2 prints depict horizontally oriented grids. Marden's direct inspiration for this work was the experience of traveling by boat across the Adriatic Sea from Bari in Italy to Patras in Greece, and then on to the island of Hydra. In its starkly divided composition, Adriatics A, the work here, conjures a horizon line dividing sea from sky. The dark aquatint evokes the dense depths of water, while the irregular diagonal lines on the upper half suggest forward movement, possibly gusts of wind or even sails. In his print, Marden was not trying to represent nature, but instead to evoke the experience of being in nature. Marden noted of this series, quote, "The image is an equivalent for the original experience," end quote, by which he connects the print directly to his encounter with nature, but neither one is more significant than the other. In a notebook that he kept during this first of many trips to Greece, Marden wrote, quote, "I am seeing my life as part of the struggle between man and nature. My work comes out of observation and acceptance of nature. Man, part of nature, absorbs and digests and pushes it back out in the form of art." Adriatics is exemplary of this interest in capturing the essence of a landscape in the natural world and filtering it through a formal language that employs the spare and subtle vocabulary of minimalism. The medium of etching itself also reminded Marden of engaging with the natural world. When describing his preference for etching over lithography, Marden claimed, quote, "Lithography is like ice skating. I would rather walk through the mud." The physicality of working up, etching, and printing the copper plate was much more rewarding for Marden than other printmaking techniques, as it ultimately enabled a higher degree of connecting with his materials and the world around him. So now we will turn to Agnes Denis, who might be considered an unlikely minimalist, as her work often occurs on a maximal scale. Born in Budapest in 1931, Denis moved first to Sweden and then to New York to study painting at the New School in Columbia. Denis soon abandoned painting in favor of more unconventional media, most notably land art. She was an early pioneer of land and ecological art in the 1970s, and in 1982 created one of her best-known works, Wheatfield, a confrontation, for which she planted 2 acres of wheat over a landfill in Battery Park in Manhattan. Ecological and environmental concerns have been key to Denis's art practice from the 1970s to the present day. Across media, from land to print, the figure of the pyramid has been central to Denis's work, as it represents for her a diverse array of associations. Pyramids can be both logical, man-made structures and evoke natural phenomena like mountains. Denis once described them as, quote, "paradoxes of existence" that connect the architecture of past civilizations with imagined futuristic dwellings. For example, she has used the figure of the pyramid to imagine possible civilizations or cities after the Anthropocene. Like Marden's print, the work that we've included by Denis in our installation comes from a larger series entitled Suite of 5 Lithographs from 1994. Taken together, the series shows a geometric pyramid morph and begin to move through space. This print, the second in the series, is called When the Pyramid Awakens, And it shows the upright pyramid as it starts to soften and contort. Through her descriptive title that suggests an awakening, she ascribes an anthropomorphic quality to the pyramid. Other prints in the series bear similarly evocative titles that connect nature to futuristic civilizations, and I'd like to briefly list them here, although we didn't include them in the installation. The Pyramids as They Were, Flying Half Bird, an Organic Space Station, Flying Pyramid for the 22nd Century, and Fish Pyramid, a Floating City. Despite the organic quality of the pyramid's movement, each pyramid is composed of a stepped grid of silvery blue lines, which brings Denis's work into contact with the minimalist grid systems found in many of the works in this installation. This grid is really what prompted us to include Denis's work here, as it shows a continued use of minimalist forms into the 1990s. It is difficult to capture in photographs, so I encourage you all to visit the installation in person if you can. But this lithograph was printed with a light blue ink mixed with mica dust, which transforms the ink into a reflective, almost sparkly substance. Mica dust is a mineral which is used to make electronics as well as to add shimmer to a range of cosmetics. However, mica is obtained through extractive mining practices. Denis's use of this material is intended to implicate such processes of extraction and land exploitation, as well as to bring the natural world physically into the figure of the pyramid. Through its materiality, she connects her prints to the environmental issues that pervade her work in land art. Actually, one of her most recent major projects has been the creation of Living Pyramid, a hand-planted pyramid in Socrates Sculpture Park in Long Island City, which she completed in 2015, 20 years after these prints were made. Both Martin and Denis expand the boundaries of minimalism to include the natural world, either through evocative association or through their choice of materials. In so doing, they reject this purely industrial or systematic view of minimalism, and instead invite the viewer to contemplate or question how artists draw distinctions between the natural and the man-made. I will now turn over to Mitchell.
Thank you, Isabel. So I'm going to be talking about this work on the right here by Charles Gaines. It has quite a long title. It's called Numbers and Trees, Palm Canyon, Palm Series 4, Tree Number 3, Chumash. And it's from 2021. And it's a very recent acquisition by the Yale University Art Gallery. So we're very pleased to have it in this show. It's an aquatint print. So Charles Gaines is an influential African-American artist born in 1944 in South Carolina, who spent a good portion of his career in New York City and is currently located in Los Angeles. And he's influential not only for his art, but also because of his role as a professor at the California Institute of the Arts, where he's mentored many now successful contemporary artists, such as the painter Mark Bradford. And Gaines is also a writer and critic of contemporary art. He's published several books. And in recent years in particular, I think his importance and his reputation has grown, kind of retrospectively recognizing the importance of his career. So the tree, which is obviously the main motif in this image, is repeated across Gaines's career. And they're often used by him to make different kinds of political references specifically, such as to migrant rights, to colonialism, to indigenous rights. And here, this tree is a Californian palm tree. And the title of the work indicates a link to the Chumash people, who are a group indigenous to California, but now largely deprived of their land by colonial powers. So it's really meant, I think, as a reference to indigenous rights here. Gaines's process is to photograph a tree and then convert its silhouette onto a gridded plane by coloring in some of the squares with acrylic. And this is set atop the non-gridded pink tree beneath. And something very important about this work is the plexiglass box with the black grid, which encases the image below it. So there's a really crucial three-dimensionality to this work. If we go to the next slide, we can see a bit of a close-up of this plexiglass. And the effect is that the planes of the box and the underlying image will shift in relation to each other as the viewer moves around it, as they change their position. And this kind of accentuates the layering of tree images with the hard black grid, which is offset by this efflorescence of softer blue and orange squares, creating, I think, a very beautiful juxtaposition of kind of regularity and order with something softer and more organic. And you can kind of see here as well, you can't make it out very super well, but you can sort of see that small numbers are written into some of these boxes to create additional shapes. There's a center column numbered 0 with digits that increase as they move outwards horizontally. And Gaines has done many works using a technique similar to this that converts photographic images into a grid of numbered boxes. I kind of think of it almost like a manual digital image, because digital technology, computer screens, show images by converting light into numerical values, distributed across a plane of pixels. So there's something analogous there, but what's intriguing is that Gaines was doing this long before digital technology. So pretty prescient in that way, I think. But Gaines connects these methods to his personal experiences. So he was born into the segregated South, and from an early age, he was confronted with an arbitrary and violent system of racial classification, which tried to impose its categories onto human beings, onto Gaines himself. And this is sort of an underlying influence for a lot of Gaines's work. Gaines says that his goal is to, quote, reveal the subjective as a political construct and focus on certain paradoxes in the process of perception, unquote. And I think what Gaines means is that what we take to be natural or objective is often influenced by human constructed systems, even when we don't realize that this construction is taking place. And this, I think we can think of as overlapping with a key interest of minimalist and conceptual work more broadly, which, as we've sort of heard already, challenged the expression of subjectivity so closely associated with abstract expressionism. And the work of artists we've seen have favored this more distanced, geometrical, mathematical kind of approach rather than gestural painting, for example. But Gaines's goal isn't just to eradicate subjective expression, but rather to interrogate how that expression is constructed and how that construction extends not just to art, but also beyond art, into politics, into society, and beyond. And Gaines says, quote, "The old idea is that you can't have feelings if you're thinking. My idea is that you can't have feelings unless you're thinking," end quote. So really trying to bring together things that are thought of as traditionally antithetically opposed, the mathematical, the objective, and the expressive and the subjective. Like Solowitz, like Mel Bachner, and others who span the distance between minimalism and conceptualism, Gaines is clearly interested in using quasi-mathematical procedures to generate the work and distance it from the hand of the artist, as I've said. And we can see a similar interest in numbering systems in early conceptualists like Bachner. And if you could go on to the next slide here. So this is a work by Mel Bachner, which is displayed right now, right next to the Charles Gaines piece. And this work is called Meditation on Theorem of Pythagoras from 1974. And it uses numbered points arranged in shapes generated from the Pythagorean theorem, which is the formula which gives the relation between sides of a triangle. So it's a kind of visual and intellectual reflection on mathematics and geometry. And we see clearly elements of this as well in Gaines's work. But I think one key difference is that Gaines really wants to emphasize a political and critical social meaning. He wants to inject these numbers, these mathematics with a meaning that relates them back to society and concrete human life and experience. So I think you could say that the formal rigor of Gaines's process, using numbers and all the rest, kind of obscures its latent political content. But as we've heard, for Gaines, they're very directly connected rather than separate. And I want to finish just by talking about one more influence on Gaines's work, aside from visual art, which is music. So Gaines learned jazz percussion as a teenager and was also interested in minimalist music. For example, Steve Reich, the composer Steve Reich, who created music using repeated basic patterns, which would slowly shift over time. And I think that both of these musical influences are evident visually or have kind of visual analogs within Gaines's work. So jazz's juxtaposition of structure and improvisation, say, or minimalist music's deployment of repeating basic patterns, they have visual equivalents here in Gaines's work, I think. And I want to finish by reading a quote about Gaines's work from Fred Moten, who's a poet and cultural theorist. And this is from his book, Black and Blur from 2017. And I think Moten really beautifully brings out the musical qualities of Gaines's art. So Moten says, quote, "All throughout Gaines's work, there's a blur materiality of shade, of colored number, in number's inexactitude, the way it's always off the beat, as beats incessant overlap and undertow and undertone and overwork, no matter what." Great, so I think now we can turn it back to Lisa and have some time for Q&A.
I always love that quote, Mitchell. Thank you for sharing that. Fred Moten's amazing. And thank you all. Thank you, John, Isabel, Mitchell, for those really stimulating and intriguing presentations. So currently we do not have any questions in the Q&A, but we hope they will come in. So actually we thought we might just talk amongst ourselves for the next few minutes, and hopefully people will post questions. One of the things that came up in our run through yesterday, which I think intrigued all of us, was that it's quite clear as each speaker discussed the works that they were going to engage, was the materiality of each object and the intimacy of each object, and the need to experience each of these objects in person, that they do not translate well to slides on a screen. So in the parlance of minimalism, one tends to think of the somewhat traditional definition as something, and this is something that, this is a point that Isabel alluded to earlier. Minimalism is a definition of something stripped down to a basic form or simple information, and yet the subtleties of these works move us to expand beyond that categorization. So John, Mitchell, and Isabel, we actually decided to discuss this topic with a few details. So John, will you start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. So when I first showed this first image of the Anne Truitt sculptural works, I mentioned that they were tall and they essentially became somewhat stand-ins for the human form. And that Truitt is, addressing something that she sees as a moment, as a memory, and is trying to give an overall perception. And so when you first are confronted with these sort of large scale forms, one tends to take them as a whole and more to their height and their verticality. But on closer inspection, if you look at the base, you realize that Truitt has introduced this sort of linear form at the bottom of each of these, essentially these paintings, similar to the works on paper. She's asked you to see it perceptually from a distance. And they're large objects. You don't come up close on them. But if the viewer is actually intrigued and is drawn in, and in Truitt's case, again, the images are at best don't really present the structural delicateness and the nuance of the paint. But if you take the time to get closer, and then you realize at the base of these forms that Truitt's asking you no longer look at this thing as an object, that's vertical. She's asking you to take in all the aspects of it. And she's asking you to look at the very bottom of it, which is, you know, traditionally not where one would be looking. So this is sort of what I mean. With Truett's work, she's asked for a moment of solitude and then a moment of introspection. And the introspection only comes if the viewer is willing to take the effort to be drawn into it. You know, most of the minimalists, the people who are associated with minimalism, often somewhat rejected the term of minimalism because they felt it was too confining. You know, to quote certainly one of my mentors, Lewitt said he felt that minimalism was a dead end, but he was certainly considered one of the major practitioners of it. But a dead end, not in the sense that it would explore just form and shape and in certain things. He felt that there wasn't the possibility to expand upon it. And I think that all of the artists that we've chosen to speak about, at least today, were individual artists who didn't feel that they needed to be confined and locked into it. So, you know, if you think of a Cubist painter, they're a Cubist painter, and they're sort of locked into that. And minimalism, it was a term that came prior in the 50s, and simply was something bolted onto this new way of looking that was going on in primarily in Western culture, but certainly there is an aspect of Asian culture that comes out through minimalism as well, which we didn't really address. There is one Asian artist in the exhibition, but you know, we don't have a lot of that work in the collection, so there are some gaps in what we presented in the exhibition. But I think it's one of the other influences. Certainly, Lewitt was influenced by the time that he spent in Korea. And all of these artists are also coming out of the end of a period of war, and it's the 60s. And so we're, as a culture, looking across the globe and thinking about what's going on in other places in the world and what those cultures might mean.
Great, thank you, John. Mitchell, did you want to talk a little bit, you know, to this topic about this piece?
Sure. So here we have again the close-up image of the Charles Gaines piece, and Charles Gaines is perhaps more a successor to the original minimalist movement, perhaps more associated with conceptualism than minimalism proper, but nonetheless, I think speaks to something that's apparent throughout the show, which is bringing out certain paradoxes in the minimalist interest in perception, in that early minimalism in particular theorized itself, as John mentioned, as trying to take relations out of the work in favor of emphasizing the viewer's experience of the relation between object, you know, and space, and, you know, the viewer's body. And it's related to what Robert Morris called Gestalt form, which are these very basic forms that can be grasped visually, you know, almost instantaneously, which is clearly opposed to the way that so many of the objects in our show really do demand a closer looking, and that closer looking reveals more and more about them. Another example I can think of a kind of paradox is some of the work by Donald Judd, a key figure in minimalism that we've included in the show. In his writing, Donald Judd emphasized the non-illusory quality of his work and of minimalist work. That is to say, it was very clear and open about what it was, about its form and what it was doing. But critics, you know, have since noticed that present in a lot of Donald Judd's work is a kind of flirtation with illusionism, even as his forms are very basic geometrical forms. They can kind of trick the eye as you move around them as to what their actual shape is, something that Rosalind Krauss, art historian and critic, has pointed out, for example, and in the work we have in the show, which is an image of some embedded boxes. Boxes are, of course, very basic shapes, but their play creates a kind of intriguing optical confusion, which is perhaps at odds with how Judd thought of his own work.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, that really, I feel like what you were discussing in this kind of idea of paradox also applies so well to the Agnes Dennis piece. And sort of like Gaines, she's sort of outside of this minimalist, she's often sort of connected more to conceptualism than she is to minimalism and specifically to land art. But I think this idea of kind of illusion and the experience of close looking and the materiality of this work really comes to the fore in this sort of the materials that she's using in this mixture of the mica dust with the ink that really can only be captured in person. I took this detail and it was very difficult to try to get a sense of both the ink and the shimmer, since, you know, as you're moving around the object, that really changes depending on where you're standing and how the light is hitting the object. And it really is this experience of looking that is emphasized by that materiality. And it really renders this systematic grid, which again was kind of the reason that we chose to include this work within this rotation, because of its connections to minimalist system. It really makes that more organic and makes it more sort of, you know, this kind of experience of looking, and adds to this movement, and really, again, calls attention to the material of the work, which is so in this idea of mica and extraction, which is really kind of central to why she's choosing to work in this manner.
Terrific. So we have a question in the Q&A about our experience curating a rotation with such a variety of objects, prints, drawings, sculptures, etc. And I think I will leave this off, the answer to this off, but then I hope that my colleagues will chime in. You know, one of the things that we realized while organizing this exhibition, and a point which was definitely a deliberate point that we tried to make with the installation, was that really more than most other artistic movements, the minimalist artists seem to really be very fluid across media, and many of them worked in many media, you know, sculpture, painting, print, drawing, and land art, as Isabel brought to the fore. And so I think that the reason why we didn't just keep it, you know, this is, after all, was intended, after all, as a works on paper rotation. But I think that the one of the reasons why we didn't want to stop there and wanted to include some small scale sculpture was to bring that point out, to expand the conversation, to show that these artists were not just sort of one or two media artists. They were very fluid in their work. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment further on that.
I could just add to that a little bit. I think in addition to showing that these artists were all working across media, I think it also brings out really interesting moments of dialogue between the prints, for example, and the sculptures that were included. I mean, we've already seen the Truitts. I think that's a wonderful example of that, kind of how she is using both these sculptures or kind of paintings, as you described them, John, as well as the drawings, and placing those next to each other, I think, you know, really adds something both to the experience of looking at the drawings and to the sculptures themselves. And I think another example of that is the Fred Sandbachs that we included in the rotation. We have this wonderful wire sculpture that we've put in this corner. And I think that has a really important dialogue with the prints that we included by him as well, which use very similar forms in these beautiful linoleum prints. And I think looking at those prints, particularly next to the sculpture, being able to see both of them, it really kind of enhances the experience of understanding his work, and both thinking about how he's moving across media, but also kind of what each media informs the kind of the language or the motifs that he's experimenting with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in a little bit.
Yeah, please.
One of the other aspects I think that is important to note that we've sort of touched on a little bit, and in line with the notion that all of these artists basically were working in multiple formats, and, as you said, fluidly and without reservation. But one of the other major aspects of the work was that when all of these artists started to produce these pieces, they were bucking up against a system that was pretty well entrenched in what was considered the art world. And the general audience came to these works and said, what is this stuff? I don't get it. It's just this shape, or it's just this piece of metal, or it's a stack of this, or a drawing of that that's a square. What's it about? And in the end, almost every one of these artists at some level had to take on the discussion to basically present not necessarily a manifesto of what their work was about, but to sort of explain, to give an introduction into what their thought process was that allowed the viewer to maybe step into over their comfort level and say, oh, I didn't understand, that before. I didn't see that before. Lisa, can you go to the second slide, the first Truett slide? So on the far left, there's a clipped image of an Ellsworth Kelly piece, and it's a sort of a peculiar form, and it's in a blue, and I only mention it because when people often ask Kelly at the very beginning of his career, what was this stuff? What was he? What were these about? And he said, I only paint things that I see. And ultimately, I never really fully got it. And then at one point, I saw a discussion with him, and he showed an image of one of his paintings, and then an image of a photograph. And ultimately, the space that was in the photograph that wasn't occupied by anything except the sky, sort of this open, dead space of sky, was ultimately the inspiration for what he painted. So often this stuff is very personal, very intimate, and yet so removed from the general viewer's initial contact of what they understood. So you're coming from, realism, you're coming from, abstract expressionism. So suddenly here's this stuff, and it's like, what is that? How do you step over, yourself to understand the work? And so many of these artists were indeed writers. And I think if the viewer to the exhibition is intrigued, they really should go back and look at some of the things that these artists wrote about, because it wasn't necessarily to justify their work. It was to sort of give the potential viewer somewhat of an introduction into their thought process.
I just put a little bit on John's comments by speaking to the historical context a little bit more, and noting that abstract expressionism was accompanied by a very intense discourse of medium specificity, the attempt to determine what was a sort of the essential characteristics of, say, the painting or the sculpture, and to be true to those characteristics in the artwork, to surface them, to show them in the artwork itself. And abstract, or rather minimalism, in many ways, is sort of simultaneously adhered to that and broke with it. For example, Donald Judd said that his early works, or his works were, neither painting nor sculpture, but something else, just objects. And today we sort of can't help but thinking of them still as sculpture or as prints or whatnot. But the artists themselves, I think, were trying to both reflect on the experience of the essential experience of what it is, sort of perceptually, to encounter these things, but also in doing so move away from the idea that each medium had to have an essential set of characteristics that the artist has to adhere to. And then, it opens up to all kinds of more diverse encounters, as John was mentioning, personal things and so forth.
Great points. So we have a couple more specific questions. This one for John. John, you mentioned that Anne Truitt was also a writer of 5 literary books. And as John just said, many of these, many minimalists were incredible writers and still are. But in terms of Truitt, did she produce any works of art incorporating words and phrases any collages, journals using both, or was her work very much like what we're looking on screen?
The works pretty much stayed separate. They become surrogates. The literary work is very personal, very diaristic. So the piece on the right, the ones that are summer of '96, so they basically, they're works that were created in the month of June. And so she would approach things like that, but she was also writing in these day books, what her travel was, a perception. So that one quote I read about the women washing dyed fabric in the river. So they're very separate, but to my knowledge, she did not incorporate language physically into any of the works.
Okay.
Other than in the titles, and the titles are all quite referential to either a date, a time, or a place, or a name. So from that perspective, yes, the titles of the works are definitely relative to her writing, and some of which are incomprehensible. But the piece Amour, I can't find a surrogate translation for it, so I have really no. Perhaps I didn't dig deep enough, but I couldn't find what ultimately where that title comes from.
We also have a question about Agnes Martin. I don't know, Isabel, if you want to speak a little bit about the Agnes Martins in the show.
Sure, yeah, maybe go back to the slide if you can, where you can only see a very
half of the Agnes Martin.
Half an Agnes Martin. Yeah, so we did include, oops.
Sorry.
No, it's on the one with the Martin.
No, I know.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, so we did include two, which you can only very slightly see there, of Agnes Martin's series On a Clear Day, which is composed of 30 prints. Again, this was actually something that came up a lot, especially with the works that I was talking about today, in that we had to, because of space constraints, only select one or two works from often much larger portfolios or series that these artists were working in. And Agnes Martin in this work is really playing with the relationship between sort of the square and rectangles. It's kind of using this grid system and seeing how far she can push that by changing the size of the grid, changing where one is breaking sort of the lines down, both vertically and horizontally. Something that's sort of interesting, which I think partially motivated our decision to place this next to the Martin, or at least in kind of how I've been thinking about the Martin for this talk, I think is interesting, is that she was largely inspired by moving to New Mexico during this period when she was creating this work. Martin was. And unlike Martin, she's inspired by this new moving from New York into New Mexico, this extremely different sort of natural surroundings. But she doesn't try to create the same sort of metaphor or sort of evocation of that in her work like Martin is doing. Instead, she's really staying true to this sort of this systematic in her work and not going sort of more towards the expressive. But I think it's a really wonderful and a beautiful sort of method of printing. She's using this sort of silvery ink as well, which to some degree actually brings it into context or into conversation with the Dennis. Dennis's is much more dramatic, but Martin's also has this kind of beautiful subtlety to it that I think, again, really needs to be experienced in person.
Great.
I'll just add about the Martin as well. I think her work shows that the peculiar double-sided nature of the grid, in that it's both something which seems like the ultimate machinic form. It's perfectly, can be perfectly symmetrical, perfectly composed in a way human hands, have to struggle to achieve. But on the other side, it implies this kind of perfect transcendent order, which can take on a spiritual quality. It's something that can, theoretically extend forever, this infinite grid. So it surpasses the human. It's a kind of sublime experience. So like so many of the minimalist forms, they both seem very anchored in industrial production, industrial society, but also have something spiritual or even religious for some artists about them.
Yeah, excellent. So one last question, and this is something that we've been sort of turning over in our heads, but we titled this e-conversation Minimalism and Its Legacies. And can one or all of you speak to how you think minimalism resonates today, both in the visual arts, but also in the broader culture? Uh-oh.
I can just, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just talk about a couple of works in the show that I think, well, I'll talk about one work in the show by Jenny C. Jones. So she is a contemporary artist who is clearly working with the tradition of minimalist aesthetics, but is using it in very interesting and idiosyncratic ways. And I think she shows in that way the continued relevance of minimalism for contemporary artists. So Jenny Jones is interested in using these kind of basic, clear geometrical forms and then relating them to histories which were maybe far from the minds of many of, some of the artists we've discussed here. So Jenny Jones is interested in the history of say avant-garde jazz, of radical Black arts essentially, and how abstraction can be a highly expressive medium for political sentiment. And ultimately, I think for her, it has something to do with the question of representing or expressing the unrepresentable, trying to transmit experiences and ideas which can't really be captured in a figurative painting, say. And so you end up with a more abstract rhetoric of visual forms, which, has such a strong history in minimalism. So I think for contemporary artists, there is still a lot to pull from the minimalist movement and to make it speak to contemporary concerns in a new way.
I think to your portion of the question about sort of the broader culture, maybe sort of beyond specifically the visual arts, I think there is sort of a general trend toward minimalism in terms of its relationship to sustainability and to environmental concerns. I think there's a lot of dialogue about sort of decluttering and sort of reducing our impact and, consuming less. And I think all of those relate to this sort of minimalist lifestyle that, is also sort of in reaction to this kind of culture of excess and capitalism, et cetera. And I think that really nicely connects to the Dennis. I think, both just in her general emphasis on sort of ecological and environmental concerns, but also sort of more specifically in her kind of imaginings for a future civilization and how we can potentially plan or kind of all of her work where she's planting trees onto landfills. So this kind of imagining of a future civilization or a future iteration of our civilization that exists in sort of more productive and sort of safe balance with the natural world as well.
I think that is a beautiful way to end this conversation. Thank all my colleagues for their incredible insights and words and for their collegiality in organizing this show. We really did collaborate in a wonderful way. It's really a huge treat. And thank you all visitors to this e-conversation for your interest and your wonderful questions. And we very much hope to see you both in person and virtually at future gallery programs. Thank you so much.